With the St. Louis Cardinals having an off day on Thursday, I spent my day convincing anyone who would listen that no, the new Pope is not a Chicago Cubs fan. So coming up on B-Schaeff Daily, we'll talk about that, but also some actual Cardinals baseball topics, like Luken Baker being optioned to Triple-A. What's going on, everyone, and welcome into this edition of B-Schaeff Daily. Brenden Schaeffer with you. It is Thursday, May the 8th, 2025. Just when you thought the Cardinals had an off day, they went and picked a new Pope. How about that? And as much as this is a St. Louis Cardinals baseball podcast predominantly, it did make for a bunch of pretty fun plays on words. But one of those plays on words did get people into trouble today. Because I am convinced, and I was convinced from the moment I saw it on Twitter, and it took a little bit longer until later in the afternoon for everybody else to catch up. I mostly kept my mouth shut until the wheels began to turn in the motion of the direction I thought they would the whole time. People were thinking that the new Pope, whose name I believe Robert Prevost, maybe saying it wrong, doesn't matter now. They call him Leo the 14th. But people were convinced that this guy was a Cubs fan, because he is the first American Pope. He was from Chicago originally. But there were all these tweets surfacing about, well, he's from the South Side. But no, they reported that he's a Cubs fan, even though you'd think a guy from the South Side would be a White Sox fan, naturally. And that's what he is. He's a White Sox fan. If you haven't heard this, that's factual information. But earlier in the day, everybody thought he was a Cubs fan. And I was tracing it back. I was like the guy from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, Charlie Day. He's got the bulletin board, and he's convinced of a conspiracy. That was me until everybody else realized that the new Pope is not a Cubs fan. He's a White Sox fan. It started because one guy tweeted that ABC News had reported he was a Cubs fan. And, of course, when I heard the new Pope was from Chicago, that was the first thing I wanted to know. Oh, is he a Cubs fan or is he a White Sox fan? Literally the first thing I thought of. Probably doesn't speak too highly that was my first thought, considering I was raised Catholic and went to Catholic school all the way through grade school. But that was the very first thing I wanted to know. Cubs fan, White Sox fan. So when I saw the tweet from Matt Urich, I believe is his name, and I think his bio says he's affiliated with CBS Sports in some capacity, but he said that he was watching TV, ABC News reported Cubs fan. And then people were like, really? Can we see a video of that? Do you have some proof of that? And he said, for those asking, the reporter who mentioned it said that he's the first Cardinal to also be a Cubs fan. And when I saw that, I said, nope, I'm calling fake news, because that sounds like a cheeky joke that somebody would make because it's funny and it's kind of tongue-in-cheek. But it wasn't, like, the phrasing of it, I could tell just by reading it. That's not what was reported. This is going to take off and spread like wildfire, and it's going to be bad because nobody's going to fact check. That's news in 2025. This is going to be a problem. And sure enough, everybody thought he was a Cubs fan. And it was all sourcing back to that same tweet of somebody talking about a TV broadcast without actually even linking it for the context of what was said. How was it said? And this can be kind of a lesson when it comes to just general media consumption, but like specific to baseball, sometimes there will be a quote that surfaces on Twitter from Oliver Marmol or John Mozeliak, and people say, oh my gosh, can you believe he said that? And then a few minutes later, the video, somebody else might tweet the video of it or the audio of it, and you go, oh, that means something completely different than what I thought it meant at first, because you didn't have the context. Reading something versus hearing it and seeing it can often provide a completely different frame of view. And in this case, it completely altered what was one person probably making like a tongue-in-cheek, oh yeah, the first Cardinal to be a Cub fan. How about that? It's like a bit in a stand-up routine rather than, well, everybody else really wanted to know the answer and they jumped on what they thought was the first guy giving it to them. When in fact, I kept reading. I said, oh, he's from the South Side? I guarantee he's a White Sox fan. I promise you everybody has this wrong. It goes so far, though, that Yahoo Sports, several other outlets, you look at the stories posted on their website about the new Pope being a Cubs fan, it all traces back to the same tweet. Well, this guy said that ABC News said, look, I get it if you don't want to get two sources, journalistic integrity, etc. Maybe that's a little outdated, but let's have at least one source that's firsthand information. Can we ask for that? This happens all the time. Well, I mean, Jeff Passan said, okay, are you sure? Or did you just see a tweet where somebody else said that Jeff Passan said, and then they twisted his words like it was a game of telephone? That is what happened with Pope Leo XIV being erroneously labeled as a Cubs fan when he's not one. And there's actually a St. Louis connection to all of this, that if you are Catholic and you appreciate this kind of stuff, it's even cooler, the connection that the St. Louis Cardinals, other than the fact that, the Cardinals elect the Pope, that the Cardinals actually have to the new Pope. And it was ultimately uncovered by WGN News in Chicago. And I'll explain how that happened in a moment, but not before I throw the Chicago Cubs organization under the bus, because not only did a bunch of news outlets run with this, again, it was, they said that they said, and anybody just hears, well, ABC News, and even though you didn't hear it from ABC News, that guy did, and I trust that guy, even though I've never heard of him before. Apparently, the Chicago Cubs did the exact same thing that the rest of us did. Well, a lot of people did, because on the famous marquee, the video board there outside the front of Wrigley Field, they put on, "Hey, Chicago, he's a Cubs fan." Obviously, a reference to the new Pope. And they tweeted out that image, and they were wrong, which allowed for the Chicago White Sox to have a little bit of fun with it later on. But let's go ahead, and if maybe this is the first you're hearing of this, and if so, you're probably a little confused, but I want to at least be able to give you the word from the horse's mouth, or as WGN News was able to do, the word from the brother of the horse in his mouth on the fandom of the new Pope, who is a White Sox fan. WGN caught up with the brother of Robert Prevost, whose name is John Prevost, and here's what he had to say. This is pretty good. Take a listen.
Clear up the thing about the Cubs and White Sox.
Yeah, he was never, ever a Cubs fan, so I don't know where that came from. He was always a Sox fan. Our mother was a Cubs fan. I don't know, maybe that clued in there. And our dad was a Cardinals fan, so I don't know where that all came from. And all the aunts, our mom's family was from the North Side, so that's why they were Cubs fans.
But he rooted for the White Sox.
That's right. But where it came from, I don't know, because he would have been the only one.
Okay, so that's very interesting. The brother saying he was a White Sox fan. He was the only one. Don't know why, because we didn't have any other White Sox fans in our family. Mom's side was from the north side of Chicago. They all rooted for the Cubs. But did you catch there what he said about the father of the Pope? The father of the biggest father in the Catholic Church at this point. Listen to this.
Our mother was a Cubs fan.
Maybe
that clued in there. And our dad was a Cardinals fan. So
our dad was a what? We're talking about the new Pope. His dad was a what now?
In there, and our dad was a Cardinals fan. So
well, I'll be darned. God loves the Cardinals. That's what it is. That's what it boils down to, clearly. The father of the new father, well, he was a Cardinals fan. So there you go. But clearing it all up, this guy's like, I have no idea why people said he was a Cubs fan. He's not, never was, always rooted for the White Sox, which of course he did because he was born and raised, grew up on the South Side, went to Villanova. Notre Dame fans having a hard time with this. Saw some funny tweets about that. If we can't recruit in our own backyard, how do we let the Pope slip away from Notre Dame right there in Chicago when he goes to Villanova? But that's how he didn't know. The brother of the Pope's like, I don't know why people thought he was a Cubs fan. Well, I do. It was that one guy's tweet that I saw early in the day, and I'm like, that's going to get a lot of views, and that's going to be a problem for some people. And it was. And so let that be a reminder to sometimes, even if you think you see something from a reliable source, ask yourself, how did that reliable source come up with the information? Because a lot of times in the story, reputable outlets will credit, right, where they're coming up with things. And so Yahoo Sports, reputable name, trusted name, right? But they say, well, this guy said it, and he said that ABC News said it. Okay. Backtrack a little bit, though. How do we know? Turns out wasn't the case at all. One ABC News anchor might have made a joke in passing about, Cardinal, and he's a Cubs fan. How about that? And then everybody, because one guy took it and said, hey, this is what they said, everybody ran with it. So kind of a little fun and journalistic integrity, which is coming from me, like all the time on the podcast. I'm saying, hey, Katie Wu said this, Derek Gould said that, John Denton said that. But at times you do have to make sure that, all right, well, where did they say it? Did they say Oliver Marmol said it? How did that information come through? And a lot of times by doing those exercises, you can try to cut off some of the, this is what it was perceived as, but actually, this is what it was in a group scrum where Oliver Marmol said this. And it's not to say that anybody would be twisting words, but, you have to be responsible for what you're putting out there. And later on, could Yahoo Sports go back and say, well, I don't know, I thought ABC News was right. So, well, no, Yahoo Sports is who put it on their website. So ultimately, it kind of looks bad on them for perpetuating it, even though they could say, well, that guy said it. No, that guy said that he saw on TV that somebody said. But do you hear how that is a lot of degrees of separation? Just my little soapbox for the day. I'm even the last person to be, getting all riled up about this. But I do think it's interesting in modern media to be able to look at that and say, this is actually how it happened. I was even talking to my dad who, sent me the thing about, he's a Cubs fan. I said, Dad, I wouldn't be so careful. I'm not convinced. I don't think he is a Cubs fan. And I think the information is going to come out in a few hours. And he's like, well, what do you mean? I saw it. You can Google it. It's right ever. I know. But when you take a step back and you realize it's everybody using the same source for, they're sharing it and amplifying it. But when you recognize at a ground-based level of how that came to be, just because a million people on Twitter have seen it doesn't make it true. And you can very easily see, this guy was watching TV and somebody said, first Cardinal to be a Cub fan, but they weren't reporting it. They were kind of tongue-in-cheek, which in the first place, probably a dangerous thing to do in the modern era where that person should say, I'm just kidding. We don't know that for sure. Not confirmed. Just be like, okay, we're not going to take off and run with this. But that is a good lesson in how those things can happen. So I probably think this is more interesting than anybody else does, but I did find it kind of fascinating today, and I was waiting for the other shoe to drop, and eventually it did when I saw the WGN news clip that we played here on the show. And by the way, maybe the funniest aspect of all of this is the Cubs falling right into the trap. They didn't do their journalistic integrity. Well, I don't know. A guy said that ABC News said, so it must be true. Put it on the marquee. Tweet it out. Okay, gotcha. The Chicago White Sox were able to then put it on their marquee with a video of the brother saying, I don't know why anybody thought he would be a Cubs fan. How ridiculous would that be? And so the White Sox, while they have nothing to cheer about in the standings, they do have the Pope. They can at least claim that. They also lost 4 games in a row to the Royals this week, so truly it is all that they have right now because the White Sox are, I think, just as bad as they were last year, it would appear. Okay, enough about the White Smoke Cardinals. We'll talk about the St. Louis Baseball Cardinals as we proceed here, although I did have fun with everybody else on Twitter today, and I said, hey, 5 straight wins, now you got a new Pope. The Cardinals are really starting to figure things out. I was proud of that tweet. Made me laugh, made a few other people laugh. But that was the name of the game today, with the Cardinals not actually playing a game. There are some roster machinations, though, to talk about from Thursday. And really, this was from late Wednesday, but we still don't have the other shoe dropping on this roster move. But we did see with the transaction log on the Cardinals team website and the player page for Luken Baker, that Luken Baker is on his way to Triple-A Memphis. And in fact, I was going to check to see if the Redbirds had played today and if Luken Baker was in the lineup on Thursday. But of course, another postponement because it doesn't ever stop raining ever is kind of where we are on this whole deal. So they're ruining down on the farm for us today, I suppose, because we don't have anything to add on the Memphis Redbirds front since they didn't play. Let's see. Springfield is in action as I record this, so we can at least do a little down on the farm action with the Springfield Cardinals and tell you what's going on down there, what J.J. Weatherholt is up to, etc. But okay, good to know. But yes, Luken Baker to Memphis, which means we presume that Friday Ivan Herrera will be activated in time for the Washington Nationals series as the Cardinals start up a 3-city road trip through D.C., Philadelphia, and then Kansas City before making their way back home later this month. The Cardinals have 15 home wins, which I believe the Cards and the Dodgers are the only 2 teams in baseball, at least as of when it happened yesterday, to achieve a 15th win at home already this season. That does you a lot of good when you're playing 162 at home, but when you're playing half your games on the road, you also have to win there. The Cardinals are 4-13 on the road, and they've got some work yet to be done to get to a requisite mark in away games. This trip is going to be the opportunity to do that, I believe, because for as much as the Philadelphia Phillies and even now the Royals are some very good ball clubs to start the season, the Nationals are sub 500. You go in there with a chance to hopefully take a series and maybe sweep it. I think there is a look for the Cardinals to potentially sweep this series. You don't have your top arms necessarily on the mound because right now I would consider Sonny Gray and Matthew Liberatore to be the Cardinals' two best. We saw that earlier this week against Pittsburgh, both guys going 7 innings. But it'll be Fedde against the Nationals, his former team, on Friday. And then you'll have Andre Pallante looking to bounce back and Miles Michaelis taking on Mackenzie Gore on Sunday. So while maybe you're not going to win it with starting pitching, I think it could be an opportunity for both, as long as Eric Fedde and Andre Pallante can stay out of trouble against the few pitfalls in this Nationals lineup, which I think includes C.J. Abrams, James Wood, and you probably look at Dylan Cruz as somebody you want to pay attention to as well, as he's off to a slower start this season, but certainly the prospect renowned to make sure you're careful with him. But if you're able to avoid the pitfalls and you can feed strikes to the rest of that lineup, rely on your defense behind you, we could see some good outings from Fedde and Pallante, and then Michaelis is just going to need to kind of do what he does sometimes as the lesser of the two in a build matchup. If he's going up against a pitcher that's got a bigger name than him, which is a lot of pitchers, but when that happens, sometimes it seems he's able to lock in and surprise you and give you more than what the matchup on paper would indicate he might. I think it's going to be a weekend where the Cardinals offensively, though, are really going to have to carry the load. You get them 5 or 6 runs in each game. I think the Cardinals could win a lot of these tight ones, 6-3, 6-4 type of vibes this weekend. The bullpen could be, or I should say should be, completely rested and ready to go because you had an off day on Thursday, and then prior to that, you had 2 7-inning performances where Ollie Marmol had to only go to a couple of relievers for each of those games to clean things up. And guys like Ryan Helsley should be more than rested. Eric Fedde needs a 6-inning, 1-run performance on Friday to get Helsley into a game. And then you can get the weekend off on the right note and continue on what is currently and still is, as we record this, a 5-game winning streak for the Cardinals. But without Luken Baker, the Cardinals will be going to task against the Nationals. And we do expect Herrera to be called up. So when that happens on Friday, you'll have Ivan Herrera, you'll have Pedro Pajes, and you'll have Joel Pozo, who makes the cut. We talked about this in the last few days when we were anticipating the arrival of Ivan Herrera as to whether or not the Cardinals would send Pozo back or whether Luken Baker would be the likely candidate. And we came to the conclusion, and it was the same one that the Cardinals did ultimately, that Pozo would be the better name to keep. Now, I got into some conversations and some back and forth with some Cardinals fans on Twitter today, one of whom, I believe his name is Richard, who kind of made the joke, oh, the Cardinals have 4 catchers on the roster. They're playing 4D chess when it comes to roster building this season. And I kind of went back and forth, and not to pick on Richard, but I think that's an unfair characterization for the way that the Cardinals are managing the roster. First of all, Wilson Contreras is no longer classified as a catcher, nor should he be. He won't catch an inning this season. So he's a first baseman. I understand that he's been a catcher, but he's not one. It just, I guess, feels like a funnier way and like a way to dunk on the Cardinals to be like, haha, they have too many catchers. You only need like 2, and they've got 4. And I think that's like the impetus behind it. But I don't really understand why that's a negative for the Cardinals at this point. Like, okay, sure. In theory, you have just the appropriate amount of catchers. You have a couple of them that handle the backstop duties. Catchers generally aren't your best hitters, and so why have more than you need? And then you can fill out the rest of your bench with other guys who can positionally map out the backup roles behind your starters. That's ideally what you'd have. And last year, the Cardinals did not have a very good bench. Not only was it a bad bench, but it wasn't a bench that fit. The puzzle pieces didn't really fit together. You had some spare parts and pieces that when you added it all up, it was like Oliver Marmol was probably looking, going, what do you want me to do with this? What am I supposed to do with this bench? Brandon Crawford, well, he's a left-handed hitter, and he can't hit, but also he can only play shortstop as the backup, and he's also not very good at it. Is that good? Is that what you want? Okay, perfect. Awesome. And since that maybe doesn't provide us a bunch of flexibility. What we'll do with this other roster spot on the bench is we'll have Matt Carpenter. He also bats left-handed, also not a very good hitter at this point in his career, to where he's going to provide you a ton of flexibility. Now, he would be a fine pinch hitter, option off the bench against righties. He served in that role, and it's good to have that. And if you've got it, great. But he wasn't going to start for you, and if he did, it was at like first base. And that's really his position. Like, okay, what else you got? Well, later in the year, you got Luken Baker. He's a right-handed bat, so that's another option. He also can only play first base. Okay, what else you got for me? And you kind of go on down the list. This year, the bench is in such better shape in terms of the flexibility. Now, the Cardinals are maybe making a decision not to utilize that flexibility every time, and I don't necessarily even disagree with it. But early in the season, I feel like we saw Oliver Marmol using platoon matchups to his advantage, subbing guys out. He had Michael Ciani available for a defensive replacement, and that was another guy last year. Like, hey, you've got Ciani. He's a left-handed hitter, but he's really good defensively. Also, probably not going to use him to pinch hit. Yeah, too many lefties. That's why Jordan Walker at one point last year was called up to basically be a right-handed platoon bat off the bench, even though his splits suggested he wasn't actually better against lefties than righties. He was a bad fit for the role, but he was still better than anybody else they felt they had in the organization at the time. That's how bad the roster building was last year. I totally agree with it. It was a mess. This year, though, I think they started out with a bench that made sense, but I called it a luxury to have a guy like Michael Ciani off your bench because I think winning teams that expect to contend, can have a Ciani that comes in and he's a stalwart defensively, but you don't ache for a guy like that to bat. You're not feeling like you're wasting a spot with his bat because those contending teams that have guys like that, well, their lineups are so good that you're not really worried about having the extra 13th batter, pinch hitter off your bench. Not the end of the world if you don't. But then the Cardinals weren't looking like a winning team, and they no longer really had the luxury to say, we don't really need the bat, because Ciani doesn't provide anything with the bat. There was a point in time where I tried to be fair to him and say, he could maybe turn into something offensively. I think we've seen enough to know that that's not going to happen. If he's going to be a guy at the big league level that plays every day and have a 600 OPS, I think he's worthy to play in the big leagues every day. But I don't think he's going to ever have much more than that low 600s OPS if he should ever get that chance again, which I don't think is going to come with St. Louis because Victor Scott II has lapped him and has a much higher upside offensively, as we always knew to be the case. We're now seeing that play out. But as we get into this year's bench, it's like right now you have a Jose Barrero who can play some shortstop, can play some center field, can do so pretty well defensively with the glove work. He's got some speed. He can run. And he's hitting a little bit too. Nice to have guys like that and guys who are 27 years old. So I'm sure he'd like to play every day, but he's not going to, and probably knows the drill with his, the stage in his career that he is in, and that's just fine. Whereas with like a Thomas Sajaci, he's 23 years old, should be playing every day wherever he is, and therefore he can't sit the bench 4 or 5 days in a row like a Jose Barrero may be able to do. Now, if he continues to play well, does Oliver Marmol try to plug him in more to see what they can get out of him? Perhaps that happens. But the general point is it's fine and actually good to have bench players like Barrero, who there is no expectation of, we got to get him in the lineup to keep him fresh. No, you don't. He's just there, and that's why he's there. Joel Pozo, I think, can end up being very similar from an offensive perspective. Luken Baker was kind of in that role before. Whereas at the beginning of the season, Oliver Marmol was using his bench, and Baker would come in for a lefty when there was a left-handed reliever on the mound late in the game. He would come in. That makes sense. It's a platoon advantage. But then more recently, we're seeing guys like Nolan Gorman, for example, take those at-bats themselves. Or an Alec Burleson's taking that at-bat himself, where you're not subbing out the player necessarily. You want to see how that 23, 24, 25-year-old young left-handed hitter would respond in that key moment to where down the line you can maybe make decisions about what that player is and what his future should be with your organization. That's part of what 2025 is about. Although the Cardinals are still going to try to win as many games as they can, it's going to be under those guardrails and that guideline of let's find out, let's aid the development when it comes to guys like Gorman, Walker, etc. So Luken Baker's role was to not hit for basically a week. He played, I think, the final day of April, and then didn't play again until May the 7th, which was yesterday. He had a pinch hit and got a hit, right? It ended up working out. But that usage had come sparingly, and it was not expected to continue even being as frequent as it was when Herrera comes back And the notion of he's going to be in the lineup as a DH against left-handed starting pitching, as Luken Baker was a few times at the beginning of the year, just was not going to happen anymore. So if you boil it down, I don't really care what position it is because Pozo can actually catch, which is a plus, not something to make fun of the Cardinals for, versus Luken Baker, who was the alternative solution in this situation. Like it was going to be one or the other. And I know that it might just be a larger commentary, and Richard specified. I'm really just talking about not Baker specifically, but the entire idea of roster building and how right now the Cardinals have more guys than they have daily spots in the lineup that they're trying to get a look at. And yes, we kind of trace that back to Nolan Arenado still being here, which wins them more games because he's a good player. But it also means that some of the guys that you were trying to get everyday playing time for, instead of playing every day, they're going to play 4 times out of 7, 5 times out of 7, etc. And that inherently changes the picture of it. So again, like I said, not to pick on Richard too much because his point was the same point that a lot of Cardinals fans make, but I just wanted to use his tweet as an example to kind of launch into the topic because I don't really care that the Cardinals have 3 catchers on their roster. They don't have 4, and I don't care that they have 3 because the alternative was to have 2, one of which is coming off of a knee injury, and so the Cardinals might want to be careful with Herrera behind the plate anyway, although they did make him stay longer at the rehab assignment to get more work behind the dish before calling him up. But I look at it and say, his bat needs to be in there. So Luken was never going to DH again against a left-handed starter because you could DH Herrera and you could start Pedro Pages, or you could start Yoel Pozo if you really wanted to at this point. So that's a benefit to the team, not something to necessarily, shake your finger at the Cardinals for. I don't mind having that third catcher. And if nothing else, let's just say they don't need the third catcher because Ivan Herrera is ready to go defensively and he's up to speed. Perfect. Well, Joel Pozo is still hitting better than Luken Baker, who's got a 690 OPS. Joel Pozo has an OPS above 800, and he's got a 300 batting average. So, to me, it was a no-brainer to keep Pozo on the team. I don't care if he never sees the field again. If it's just a role for a bat off the bench, yeah, it's a role that the Cardinals may not get much utility out of right now if they're insisting to not necessarily sell out for the platoon advantage every time, and they're going to prefer, perhaps, to see what guys are made of in those spots, which is something that I think can also pay dividends for them, so I'm cool with it. But it just makes for a different conversation for Luken Baker, which is why he just didn't fit as much on the roster. You weren't keeping him for his positional flexibility anyway, and if that's true, might as well have the guy who can also catch in a pinch, which Joel Pozo is going to be able to do. So I have no problem whatsoever with the Cardinals making the move that they made with sending Luken Baker out and the move that they're going to make, which is to bring up Ivan Herrera by Friday's game. And I think it's going to be a big deal to get Ivan Herrera's bat back. Of course, we've talked a lot about the fact that he was basically their best hitter before he went down, and they've been about a month without him, and to get him back, I think, is going to make a pretty big difference. You think about the numbers in this lineup right now, guys like Nootbaar, Mason Wynn, both sitting with a 775 or better OPS. Brendan Donovan's in the mid-800s in OPS. Wilson Contreras is in like the 720 range, but he's been rapidly improving. And then you've got Arenado, who's in the mid-700s or so, maybe a little below that. Victor Scott is above 750 right now. You're quickly able to identify like 5 dudes who are looking pretty good at the plate. Add Herrera as a 6th, and suddenly, maybe Alec Burleson, I mean, he's been trending in a better direction. The season numbers aren't quite there yet. And you're still kind of looking for Gorman and Walker, I think, to pick it up consistently. But this Cardinals lineup, the way that I look at it, and I talked about it yesterday in the video that we posted from the Big Show on KTGR, and I finished that video by basically saying, I think this Cardinals team, as far as their expectations, I'm still right around where I was to begin the season, but I'm certainly not any lower than I was, where I said 83, 84 wins. And the way to get above that is still accessible to the Cardinals, but what they have to be is a top, I think, 10 offense in runs scored. I think they're like in the middle of the pack right now. They were 12th, but then the day off today, everybody else plays a game. They're kind of like 13th, 14th or so in runs scored. I think the Cardinals need to be basically like a top 12 or even arguably a top 10 offense if it's going to happen, because I expect that their rotation is going to be somewhere in the middle of the pack. Sonny's been really good. Liberatore has been fantastic. Guys like Fedde and Palante have been hit or miss. Michaelis has, the numbers on the whole aren't as good, but has been giving you a chance as your number 5 starter. But right now it kind of feels like you have a number 1 in Sonny, a number 1B in what Liberatore has been, and whether he maintains that is obviously related to how high of a ceiling does this rotation have. But I would say 2 frontline starters is how you're getting performances right now from Sonny and Libby. And then it's kind of like a bunch of number 4s and number 5s. Palante, Fetty, Michaelis, they're all sort of back in the way that they're performing right now. You'd like to see them be able to hit a higher ceiling on that than they have so far. And if they do, it means good things for the rotation. But I still don't think this is a rotation that etches into the top 10 or top 12. They're like a top 16 rotation. And that would be okay. That would be more than fine. The bullpen is still a wild card. For a while, it was pretty good. Then it was brutal. And then it was pretty good again. And I think we're on the upswing with what we're seeing from that unit. Get a guy like Roycroft back into feeling good about his stuff. He was able to get a scoreless ninth inning against the Pirates to cap off Wednesday's game. Suddenly you might start to think about Graceffo, Matz, like these guys are capable of leverage roles. You might end up being 7 or 8 deep in your bullpen before you know it. Ryan Fernandez could still come back. I think he will, and end up having a say as far as, what he can provide to this team. Last year, the bullpen was top 10, and their 7, 8, 9 guys were like top 5. When you think about JoJo Romero, Andrew Kittredge, and Ryan Helsley last year, if the bullpen ends up being a top half unit, and then they're able to have that requisite, winning percentage in one-run games like they did a year ago, suddenly you can squint and see the realm in which this Cardinals team can be competitive. But to me, it does not happen without that offense being the unit that carries you. It's basically the same setup as last year, except you may get better starting pitching. Well, maybe not better, because we kind of underrate what Kyle Gibson and Lance Lynn provided. I'm going to say it's the same setup as last year, but your offensive contributors are maybe a little further along in their careers to be able to establish themselves as the guys that they want to be. Whether you get that from Gorman and Walker remains to be seen, and it could end up being the crux of whether you have a top 15 lineup versus a top 10 one. If those guys continue to just absolutely flounder, which I shouldn't say continue, because Walker had a big hit the other day. Gorman was 1 for 3 with a walk. But on the season so far, they've both been floundering. Not specific to their most recent game, but in general. Like Burleson has been down. But if the guys who aren't picking it up kind of pick it up a little bit, and everybody in this lineup is either average to good, even if not very many of them are great, if any, could it be a top 10, top 12 lineup? It could be. And if it is one, that's the realm to stay above 500 by 2, 3, 5 games as you get into July, and then maybe have to make some decisions about buying or selling. And maybe you kind of do it on the fly and you do sell some short-term pieces because you've got more starters down below. Michael McGreevy can come up and help you, and you maybe don't skip a beat. So if Eric Fetty's looking good, you trade him anyway, and McGreevy slots in. Like Steven Matz gets traded from your bullpen, but you hold on to Helsley and you bring up Graceffo into suddenly Graceffo's in the role where he's another reliable leverage arm that you didn't know you had. And I don't know if they will hold on to Helsley. That seems like the one guy that they have to trade unless they're really sure they're going to make a playoff run, which it's hard to be that sure about this roster when they didn't pour anything into it in the offseason. And like Maton would be another guy that you could probably trade from, and that would be a way to maybe lose more games this year, but could you pick up some pieces if they have attractive names at the deadline? We might have to do a podcast tomorrow or a video about what Mark DeRosa had to say recently for MLB Network. It was kind of interesting to see a national perspective on what the heck is going on with the Cardinals and what's their plan going to be, because right now they're right smack dab in the middle, and they could still veer in either direction. But I just wanted to hammer the point home. If it's going to go better than people think this year, they have to have the offense do it. They can't have the 22nd in run score that they had last year, because that won 83 games, and it took an outlier performance in one-run games and from the back-end bullpen to do it. This year, the bullpen might regress back to being not quite as good as it was last year as a top 6 or 8 unit in ERA, especially from the back-end guys. And it might instead be like the 14th best bullpen. If that's so, you're not going to win 83 games with the 22nd best offense. You're not going to win 83 games probably with the 16th best offense. But if you have the 12th best or the 10th best or the 8th best offense, now suddenly you're in a range where it's worth it to talk about this Cardinals team as a potential contender. But I don't know if we're there yet. A lot of people yesterday said, I haven't really changed my opinion yet. 19-19, it's kind of about where a lot of people thought they would be. It's still better than what some people thought they would be, because Vegas had the win total at like 77.5, and right now they're exceeding that pace. But there's a lot of season left to go, and they've got 9 road games coming up where the Cardinals are going to have to prove their mettle away from Busch Stadium. If they can do it, though, would that convince you as a Cardinals fan that there might be more to this team than you thought previously. Let me know in the comments below, and make sure to hit that subscribe button on YouTube and to follow the podcast on Spotify. I would really love to pick up some additional Spotify followers. Search B-Schaeff Daily anywhere that you listen to podcasts, and you can find the show. And once again, I'll remind people, if you want to join the YouTube membership, that's available to you in the video description below. But that's going to do it for this edition of the show. Appreciate you guys, as always, for listening, and we'll talk to you next time on B-Schaeff Daily. Peace.